Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Her Chosen Groom. Chapter 1. Harold dear, you know you don't like conversation at the table, Ada reminded her husband. She looked across the large mahogany setting that was well laid for their morning meal, to where their daughter, Anna, Saturday, can't we discuss this after breakfast? Somewhere less open perhaps? Emily, their young maid, stood in visible discomfort at being privy to such a conversation. Her eyes avoided Ada's glance but were keenly fixed upon Annie, who had yet to look up from her plate. Here is as good a place as any, Ada, Harold countered and immediately gave Emily a dismissive look that sent the 16-year-old scampering. So, what have you to say in your defense, Annie? He questioned his daughter in his usual monotone. How is it that all of your friends have managed to find themselves husbands, and you have not even had one suitor to your liking? Do you wish to be a spinster all your life? Are you truly so persnickety? Annie swallowed her mouthful of scone and carefully dabbed the corners of her mouth before meeting her father's glare. It was an action to delay the inevitable and buy her time to formulate an answer that would satisfy her father's inquiry, though she doubted very much her response would be to his liking. I have no defense, father. I don't believe I need one. I am perfectly content to remain a spinster for now. She felt her father's displeasure as his gaze bore into the side of her face. Regardless, she dared to brave the ire she was inciting, and continued. I only intend to marry when and if the Lord allows. I'm well aware of my age and the limitations that it could cause in terms of prospects, but I do not believe such things matter. She turned her eyes squarely on her father, disregarding the cautionary shifting of her mother's head. In the Bible, didn't Sarah give birth at 91? Why should marriage, at whatever age I may be when it occurs, be impossible for me simply because I'm in no hurry? I have no concerns about my future. I trust in the Lord to direct my path, and He will bring me a husband in due season. Annie Josephine Thompson, do not dare preach at me. I have been in church longer than you have been out of swaddling. Her father's fist banged against the table top and made the dishes rattle. While his words were usually controlled, his hand was not. Be calm, Harold, Ada urged fruitlessly. You are not the woman upon whom the Lord would start His nation. Do not compare yourself with someone of such significance. I promise you will find yourself gravely disappointed if you think the Lord would make such an allowance for you. Has the Lord changed? Annie dared to counter. Harold's nostrils flared. I will not debate the Lord with you. It wasn't a debate, father, but a simple question to prove my point. The Lord. Do not try to change the subject, Annie. You think because your nose is ever in the Bible that you can teach me something of it? He scoffed. It will little keep you warm at night in your golden years, and your twilight is already quickly approaching. Do you think it right to make yourself such a burden upon your parents? We have raised you with good breeding and education, and afforded you the best that money can buy. Is this fair recompense for our efforts? Perhaps I was too liberal in your education that you see it fitting to try to lecture me now. Harold, Ada said gently as she placed a frail hand upon her husband's still clenched fist. She was still getting over a bout of flu that had seen her confined to her bed for well over 2 weeks, but clearly, she felt obliged to make some effort to quell the rising storm between her husband and daughter. I appreciate all you've done for me, father, Annie protested, not wanting to trouble her mother any further. I mean no disrespect, but I have chosen to wait for my husband. I want a man who will be as Boaz to me. Harold guffawed. How like you to put yourself once again in the shoes of another great woman of the Bible. He shot Annie a pointed look. And yet again, there is no comparing you. You are no Ruth, and I would have you cease with this incessant comparison immediately. Annie exhaled deeply. She hated that her father disregarded her knowledge of the Bible, for in this one thing she knew she possessed greater understanding than the scholarly man himself. You will pick a husband. One of the men I have presented to you will do. I will no longer allow you to trouble my heart nor your mother's with your idealism and naivety. His words stung. Annie had never intended to be unwed at 26, but the Lord had not yet seen fit to send her a husband. Though her father had faith, his strongest belief was in realism and practicality, and she understood her desire to marry a man who loved the Lord as much as she did, seemed foolish in his eyes. Still, it was her desire, and no man presented to her thus far measured up. They were all like her father, men of book knowledge. Unfortunately, the book whose knowledge she trusted most was foreign to them. She could not marry any of them, no matter how much her parents wanted her to be secure and settled. She simply could not. I will not, Father, she stated calmly. No matter how displeasing this may seem to you. My mind is set on following the plan God has for me. Have you ever heard such insolence? Harold bellowed, as his chair nearly fell back behind him, and the table was once again visited by an angry fist, causing both women to start. Annie's eyes lowered as the full brunt of her father's wrath fell upon her. She felt like an impudent child under his harsh gaze, but she could not be untrue to her heart or her conscience. Deep inside, where no one understood, Annie knew God had someone special for her. She only had to wait for him. She took a tremulous breath. It is not out of ingratitude or insolence that I find fault with the suitors you have presented me with, Father. I only know what I believe in my heart. The man I am waiting for is not fancy or fiction. He's real, and sooner or later, he will find me. Her father squared his shoulders. And I will tell you what I believe. I believe you to be an ingrate. You care nothing for the stress you place upon me or this household. You think only of your selfish heart. Well, it is my turn to preach to you, daughter. Jeremiah says, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked, who can know it? Yet you let your heart lead you instead of your head." Harold. Silence, Ada, while I school our daughter on the reality of her situation. As Annie looked on her mother's gaunt face, she bristled at her father's tone toward her. Still, she could make no protest. It would only incite him further, and she could tell there was no restraining him now. He went on. My time of teaching at the university is almost at an end, and with it, our main source of income. Even with a pension and your income as a teacher, we will not be able to live as we are accustomed. Harold fixed his spectacled face on his daughter. In 2 months, when my retirement is upon me, you, Annie Thompson, will marry, or you will find yourself cast out from this house and never allowed to return. Annie didn't recognize the gasp that filled the room at her father's words. Had it come from her or her mother? You can't mean that, Ada protested as alarm disfigured her features. I most certainly do. If the child I have cared for all of her life will not obey me, then she is no child of mine, and I cast her off. I give you my word. Annie met her father's gaze as her heart filled with anguish. He would cast her off? Discard her as if she were not his own? Harold's gaze remained unwavering. Marry or leave. That is your choice, he stated with finality before he left his wife and daughter to console one other. Weep as they might and protest as they would, Professor Harold Thompson had never swayed once his word had been given. Chapter 2. Your father couldn't have meant what he said. Surely, he wouldn't cast you off simply because you refused to marry one of the men he's chosen? This is 1874 after all. Women have rights. Soon, even the right to vote. There's to be a referendum in Michigan, and if it's passed, it'll set a precedent that will open the doors for all women in America to have the right to vote. So how can your father try to rob you of your right to choose your own husband? Preposterous. It's almost as preposterous as 2 years ago when they carted Susan Anthony off to jail for voting. She'd registered and been allowed to vote, then they dragged her off as if she'd done something wrong. Ridiculous. Margaret Fitzwilliam was fuming. The longest standing of Annie's friends, she'd been there for every step the younger woman had ever taken. Only a year older than Annie, she had married just 3 years ago, but already had a plump toddler to keep her contented and a liberal husband to indulge her pursuits for women's suffrage. My father is very resolute, as you well know, Annie confirmed. Still, I can't believe he would make such a vow. Her friend huffed as she plopped into the seat beside her. The child's presence was a much-needed comfort to Annie, whose love of children was profound, and made all the worse with the passage of time and the absence of her own child. "May I?" she asked with an enamored grin, as she looked at the plump little boy who was tugging on his mother's curls. "Of course, you may," Margaret preened. She watched as her friend plucked the boy from her arms. He didn't even whimper and immediately began pulling upon Annie's dark tresses. "He's lovely, Maggie. I can't believe he's gotten so big." Annie cooed as she hoisted the hefty 11-month-old over her shoulder and rubbed his back rhythmically. "That he is. I was so happy when you said you'd join me for tea today. It's been too long since you've seen him." Margaret rang the bell as Annie indulged herself in the child's antics. Moments later, a thin woman with a beak nose and beady eyes appeared in the doorway. Annie stared unintentionally, and once their tea was requested and the woman departed, she questioned Margaret on the new addition to her household. "Who's that?" "That's Nola. She started last week," Margaret admitted as she fluffed her skirts. "Gerald's work in finance has thrust us into the middle of New York's social circles. We've been entertaining much more often, and I needed someone to help me keep up. I can't do everything myself now that our little Matthew is here." The girl was planning to be a mail-order bride, but it fell through at the last minute. "Lucky for us." "Mail-order bride?" Annie questioned. Margaret wrinkled her nose at her son and gave him a smile. Annie looked on enviably. "Why, that's it," Margaret suddenly blurted out. "That's the answer for you." "What answer?" Annie replied, as she attempted to soothe the wiggly child who had been startled by his mother's sudden outburst. "It's the perfect way for you to find a husband who suits you. One that will also allow you to see more of the world. You can see another part of the country and find yourself a husband at the same time." Margaret preened with pride in her own cleverness. "Leave New York?" Annie asked excitedly. It was true she'd longed to see another part of their fine country, so a suggestion that would allow her to have both of her desires was one she was more than willing to hear. "If you have a plan, then tell me," Annie eagerly urged. "You can become a mail-order bride," her friends sang. Annie's mouth dropped open. Ada Thompson, as a young woman, was short and of average weight, with a curvy frame and a pleasant smile. Now in her late 50s, she had grown wide in the hips and slower in gait from frequent illnesses. Her face was oval with a pointed nose, which was splattered with freckles that spanned the expanse of her cheeks. Her eyes were emerald and her bottom lip was slightly fuller than the top. If not for the disparity in their hair color, Ada was a brunette while Annie had black hair like her father. The two could have been twins if they were of the same age. It was the first time in years that her mother had brushed Annie's hair. "I can't remember the last time you did this," Annie murmured, as she lost herself in the feeling of relaxation. "I do. It was Laura Gilbert's birthday." "You were 16, Ada recounted as she combed the length of her daughter's thick curls. Though age and repeated illness had weakened her mother in many ways, her mind was still razor-sharp. "You were a beauty," Ada added with smile. "I was not." Annie chuckled. "Not compared to Laura." "I never compare you to anyone else, Annie. Then and now, you were and are a beauty in my eyes." "You always will be," Ada quietly assured her. Youthful green eyes met the experience of those that had grown wise with age, and for a moment, no words passed between them, only the silent oath of their love for one another. Finally, deep wrinkles began to etch themselves around Ada's mouth. "Pass me a strip of cloth." Annie complied, and sat back as her mother curled her hair around strip after strip until none remained. She would miss her mother dearly. Her father's oath was an unbearable thought. She knew it wasn't only the exile from her home, but her complete excommunication from her family. Her father would never speak to her again, and he would never allow anyone under his roof to speak to her either. Annie would lose everything she held dear. Sensing her daughter's distress, Ada kissed the crown of her head, just as she did when she was a babe. "I know you must feel trapped by your father's edict, but remember, there is always a way with God. Trust him, even though you cannot trace him. Marry a man who's worthy, Annie." No sense marrying one just for the sake of marrying, Nell urged as she turned down the sheets of the bed. I know, Nell, Annie replied as she watched her maid. Nell Smith was a stocky woman in her early 50s, who had served in the Thompson household from shortly after Harold and Ada had wed. She'd been nursemaid to Annie from birth and was like a second mother to her. My niece married a wonderful man 5 years ago, and I got a letter from her just today telling me she's had another baby, the older woman gushed. Nell had no children of her own, but she made it her job to love any child who came across her path. How many is that now? Annie questioned. 5 strapping boys, so I'm told. I can't get out to Tennessee to see them, but I get occasional photographs, Nell explained. Tennessee? I thought Louise was here. Heavens no. She married a man from Tennessee and moved out there for the wedding. Annie crossed the room. How did they meet if she was here, and he was there? Oh, she found him in one of those husband-for-hire advertisements. Annie's mouth dropped for the second time that day. Are you saying that Louise was a mail-order bride? She couldn't help the level of astonishment in her voice. The last person she'd ever think would take such a risk was steadfast Louise McNeely. She was so level-headed, not to mention a graduate of the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania. Yes? Are you all right, Annie? Nell asked, noting the perplexed look on her mistress's face. But Louise is so practical. How could she have made such a choice? Annie questioned, still in disbelief. Nell smiled. Her father, as you know, is a lot like yours, and she was given a similar choice. She made it. She left home, got married, and hasn't regretted it for a day. Annie's eyes lowered as she considered this new information. Louise trusted God as wholeheartedly as she did. He'd taken care of her. Wouldn't he do the same in Annie's situation? Nell, she said softly. Where can I find the husband-for-hire office? Chapter 3. Ada Thompson sat stunned as she read the advertisement her daughter had just handed to her and her husband. Lawton City, Nebraska. Martha Max Wilson, single Christian farmer, is looking for hard-working, patient woman between the ages of 20 and 30 for matrimony. Must be even-tempered, consistent, educated, willing to learn and experience new things. Only single women with no children, but with a desire to have a family, need apply. Dark hair preferred. Must be Christian. Explain yourself, Harold interrupted, as he looked upon his daughter coldly. You gave me a choice, father, and I've done what you asked. I've found a husband, she explained, trying to suppress her anxiety. Annie, a mail-order bride? Is this the only thing you could come up with? Her mother questioned, panic and disapproval lacing her words. It was the only way I found fair. It gave me the option of choosing a man of my liking who shares my beliefs. And my choice isn't based on profession or pedigree. Her father bristled. More defiance, he muttered, getting to his feet. Not defiance. Submission, Annie countered, raising her eyes from the ground to meet her father's. You gave me no choice, marry or be cast off. I choose to marry, as you wanted. I simply chose the man myself. What do you know about him? Ada questioned, still seated on the couch where she and her husband had gathered to hear Annie's announcement. I know a great deal. We've written to each other frequently over the past 2 months. She moved to sit beside her mother. Taking her hand, she continued. He loves God, Mama. He's a hard worker. He owns his own farm, and he has such dreams, she divulged. I truly believe we could be happy. And you base this on his love of God and his dreams? Her father scoffed. You put your trust in his words? No, I put my trust in God. We both do. And yes, this isn't conventional, but people make this choice all the time, and it works out, she explained. But Annie, how can you be sure such a marriage will work? Her mother questioned. Ladies like us don't become mail-order brides. Louise McNeely was a mail-order bride. Now she has 5 boys and a loving husband in Tennessee. If God could do that for her, why wouldn't he for me? Her father's face contorted before her eyes. Nell's niece? Did that woman have something to do with this? Annie swallowed hard. She'd made a mistake in mentioning Louise, but there was no taking it back now. She had hoped the news that someone they knew had made a success of such a marriage would be helpful. She'd hoped it would work in her favor. She should have known better. Yes, Nell told me about Louise, Annie confirmed, meeting the questioning glances of both her parents. Nell. Nell. Harold bellowed as he marched to the salon door and yanked it open. His voice filled every corridor of the house a second later, and Annie cringed as she realized she may have just cost Nell her job. Annie, her mother said urgently. Why didn't you tell me about this before? I didn't want you to worry if things didn't work out. Oh, Annie. You should have prepared me. I could have worked on your father before now. He's not going to like this arrangement. He's determined that you pick one of the men he's chosen. Maybe I should have told you earlier, but I can't change that now. Please help me make father understand, she pleaded, knowing the only person who could pacify her father was her mother, and even then, the chances were slim. I'll do what I can, but you have to try not to antagonize him further, her mother replied, as she looked toward the salon door anxiously. When her father returned with Nell quick on his heels, Annie's heart lurched, and she gave the older woman an apologetic look. Nell, explain to Mrs. Thompson and myself the conversation you had with our daughter regarding her marriage options, her father questioned. It sounded like a trial. Nell was unfazed by her employer's remarks. She'd lived many years with Harold Thompson, and she wasn't afraid of him, unlike most of the others. She looked at him squarely. I told Miss Annie that Louise's father had given her an ultimatum about her marrying. She was getting older, and he saw her as a burden. Though how a man could ever find his own child a burden, I'll never know, she subtly scolded. Will you get to the point? Harold stiffened. As you wish. I told her how everything transpired, and where she could find the husband for higher office, Nell admitted. And she's happy? Your niece? Ada questioned, skeptically. Very much so, Nell answered, and gave Ada an encouraging smile. She understood the concerns she must have, but Nell clearly believed that Annie was making the best choice for herself, and in the end, they all had to walk their own paths alone. Louise trusted in God to guide her, and I trust him, too, Annie interjected. I've made my choice. Harold scoffed. Very well. If your mind is made up. That's it. Does this man require anything from me to marry you? A dowry or your passage to Nebraska? No. He doesn't want anything. He's already booked my passage on the train for Nebraska. I leave Wednesday. He's also seen to my room and board once there. He's isn't the kind of man to ask anything of you, father. He's responsible. That's 2 days from now, Ada interjected. Why so soon? Father gave me 2 months. It wouldn't be fair for me to stay beyond that, Annie answered, pain tainting her words. Well, isn't that wonderful, Harold sang, and all eyes turned to him. He was pouring himself a scotch from a decanter, and he seemed frighteningly happy by the fact that he wasn't going to have to contribute financially to his daughter's future. He took a long drink. Well, Annie, you better get packing if you plan to have everything ready on such short notice. Ada was stunned. Is that all you have to say, Harold? Nell bit her lip as she watched the exchange in silence. What else is there to say, Ada? Your daughter believes some backwater farmer would be better for her than a respectable surgeon. He smacked his lips. I believe that speaks for itself. He raised his glass in mocking. Good luck to you, Annie. Do remember, once you leave, there will be no more support from this house. Chapter 4. Annie was thankful for the rain. Her hair was sticking to her face and neck with the extreme heat that had reigned for most of the days of her travel. The sudden downpour was a godsend in her eyes as they pulled into a small, nondescript town with no name on it. Excuse me? Where are we? Annie questioned one of the other passengers as they disembarked the stagecoach. It had been a 2-week journey from New York to Lincoln, and a further 4 hours to their current destination. Why, Lawton City, of course. It's the only stop, the man confirmed, in a slow southern drawl. This is a city, she exclaimed, much louder than she'd anticipated. The man laughed and continued on his way, leaving Annie stunned. You gettin' off, miss? I ain't got all day, the annoyed driver stated as he stood at the coach door. She was holding up his schedule, and he had no time for people who didn't know what they were doing. Yes, I'm sorry, Annie apologized and took the hand he offered to assist her down. She tiptoed as best she could in the muck, the hems of her skirts instantly becoming coated by the inches of mire. The earth was so saturated, and her focus was so concentrated on avoiding the puddles, she entirely missed the large wad of horse dung left by her four-legged escorts. Ugh, she complained as she attempted to clean the mess, which left her with smelly shoes to accentuate her filthy hems. Topping it off, she turned in time to find the driver dumping her trunks on the road, much to her dismay. Annie stood aghast at the circumstances she beheld. How was she supposed to meet Max in such a state? She must look horrible, with her bedraggled hair and dirty skirt, and she smelled just as bad from the manure. She hoped she could find somewhere to tidy up before he arrived. Looking around the nearly empty street as passers-by gave her curious glances, she hoped to find an inn or somewhere that could accommodate her needs. Excuse me, miss, a deep, cautious voice called from behind her, causing her to turn abruptly. Yes, she answered the bushy-faced man, who was wearing a hat that almost completely covered his eyes and a suit that didn't look like it belonged to him. The buttons of his shirt were straining to contain his chest, and Annie didn't think she'd ever seen such large hands. Are you Annie Thompson? Annie regarded the man nervously. Can I help you? She questioned guardedly. The man promptly removed his hat, and the long hair he'd been concealing beneath his hat fell over his eyes. He quickly swept it back as he extended a nervous hand. I'm Max Wilson, he said slowly as he took in her distressed appearance. This was Max. You all right? He asked, carefully looking her over. Yes, I'm fine, Annie assured him, as she tried to hide her dismay. He wasn't at all what she expected. The Christian men she knew were all clean-cut and put together. Max was far from that. All right. I figured you wouldn't have eaten before you came into town, so I made plans at the cafe. I know there ain't much of a stop in Lincoln to get nothing, he replied, dismissing her obvious fib and turning his focus on her trunks. Thank you, Annie replied, tucking a few strands of flyaway hair behind her ear. It's nothing. We best get your trunks on my wagon first, he stated, noting the heavy wooden boxes that were inches deep in mud. By the time they found their seats in the cafe, neither of them looked particularly pleased. Max's pants were muddy from hoisting Annie's trunks into his wagon, but thankfully he'd been able to clean his hands before coming into the restaurant. How was your trip? He asked, clearly uncomfortable. It was all right, Annie replied. It's the first time I've traveled any distance. That's right, you did say you'd never been nowhere but home, Max commented. Annie nodded. We've been having a nice weather. Oh. It rained quite a bit just before we got here, Annie replied, shifting her knife and fork as she waited for her pot roast to arrive. Well, it's the planting season. We have a while before the rains start comin' in hard, so everyone's real happy for what rain we get, he explained. That's nice. He seemed so confident on paper, but as she sat before him, Max seemed less of the man she'd come to know in his letters. I was gonna bring you some flowers, but I wasn't sure you'd like 'em, so I didn't bother. The admission took Annie by surprise. Why would he tell her he was going to get her flowers when he hadn't? It didn't make sense, but she tried to ignore it. She gave him a half-hearted smile. Well, it's the thought that counts, isn't it? I guess. The discomfort between them was palpable. Annie didn't know what to say, and it was clear Max wasn't doing any better at making conversation either. After we eat, I'll take you to my farm so you can get the lay of the land, Max announced, as he cut into his roasted chicken. It's a 2-hour ride from here. Annie almost choked on her water. 2 hours? Yeah, Max replied, looking up. Something wrong? And no. It's just, I thought you lived in Lawton City. Well, Lawton is the closest place to my farm, and it's where all the mail comes, but I don't live here, he confessed. I thought you understood that. No, I didn't. Well, it ain't nothin'. Just a misunderstandin'. You'll be stayin' in town though, till we fix a date for the weddin', Max added casually, but he seemed to pause once the words were out. Annie's heart stopped in her chest. The wedding. Well, of course, that was why she'd come. Right, she replied solemnly, and took another bite of her food. Lord, what have I done? She groaned inwardly. Annie screamed. An ornery goat had just butted into her leg, sending her scrambling into Max's arms for rescue. Get it away. Get it away. She continued to shriek as the goat remained unmoved by her protests. She clutched the lapels of Max's jacket, completely unaware of her actions. He's just saying hello, Max explained with a laugh, as he gently unclasped her hands from his clothes and took a respectable step back. Annie felt her cheeks flush under his gaze, which seemed more questioning than concerned. We have quite a few animals here, Max announced as he continued the tour of the property. Annie followed close behind, her eyes still looking back to make sure the goat wasn't following. Oh no! Annie cried internally as she cringed at the sight before her. Max held her hand in his, leading her curled fingers to touch the side of his massive cow. This is Millie. She's my best milk producer, Max commented, as he smoothed Annie's hand flat against the large animal's flank. That's lovely, she forced, all the while trying to free her hand from beneath his grasp. She didn't like the feel of the animal, and she wanted nothing more than to extricate herself from it, but Max's hand wouldn't budge. You'll be expected to milk her every day, he announced, and Annie gasped. Me? Why yes. There's lots to do on a farm. Me and the boys will handle the big things like the plowing and the planting, but I'd expect you to milk the cow, and collect the eggs and things like that. Annie shook her head. Wait. Don't you have someone who does all that? I thought I'd be taking care of the household, she explained, still hopeful that she was mistaken about what Max expected of her. You'll be responsible for the house all right, but there's far too much to do here for you to just be worried about that, he continued, looking slightly confused. I see, Annie replied, dismay clearly painted on her face. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. She had never taken care of a cat, far less a cow. How on earth was she expected to take care of a farm full of animals? As evening began to fall, Max and Annie climbed back into the wagon to head back into town. He didn't speak, and Annie was thankful for it. She had enough to think about. That night, after being registered in the boarding house and getting her trunks into her room, Annie fell onto the single bed which stood at the center, and wept. This wasn't what she wanted. She wasn't prepared to take care of animals. What was she going to do? There was no going back. God, she cried as she clutched the sheets in her small hands. Help me. Chapter 5. I told you to pick a nice girl from Roon here, Bertie protested, as he watched Max plow the field. A girl from Roon here would know what's expected. What kind of woman comes to a farm and don't know how to milk a cow and is frightened of a lil' old goat? I knew I shouldn't have said nothin' to you, Max countered, as he held the handles of the plow to keep it steady. He liked his rows neat and straight. It made it possible to plant more, and Max needed a larger crop this year. The previous year's harvest had barely covered the pay for the men and the cost of this year's seed. He needed to do better if he was going to make ends meet this year, especially if he was going to have another mouth to feed. I told you gettin' a bride from the newspaper was a mistake, Bertie continued to argue, as he walked beside Max. I know what you said, Bertie, but I still believe God brought that woman to me for a reason, Max replied, stopping the plow. She may not be used to animals, bein' from the big city and all, but I'm sure she'll get it once she has a chance to get herself together. Just 'cause John and Will got lucky with mail-order brides, don't mean that you will, too, Bertie replied. Lightning don't strike the same place twice. Really? Well, if we're looking at John and Will, then I'd say that it already has, Max countered with a grin. Bertie shook his head. Now if you'd excuse me, I have to finish this row before I go pick up Annie. You're bringing her back there? Bertie questioned. After she almost climbed you like a pole to get away from a little old goat? You said that already. I know, but I want to make sure you heard me right. A goat, Max. It was a goat. Are you gonna keep bothering me? Max questioned. I do have work to do. Bertie threw his hands in the air in surrender. Suit yourself, but I'm tellin' you. That woman's goin' to leave town screamin' all the way back to that big city of hers. Max considered the statement. Yes, Annie was clearly disturbed by the idea of taking care of animals, but he was convinced it was just her unfamiliarity. Once she got used to them, he was sure she'd be just fine. In fact, he had already hatched a plan to speed the process along. Annie stuck close to Max's side the entire time they were passing through the yard. It amused him to see how she watched the animals like a hawk eyeing its prey, especially the goat. Now, the first thing you gotta get used to on a farm is milking the cow, Max divulged as he led Annie into the barn. Annie nodded her understanding, but the look on her face spoke much louder than her gesture. She was horrified. Max hoped it would pass. Don't worry. I'll show you what to do, he stated as they neared the stall. Once there, Max pulled out the stool and the bucket he kept in a corner in the barn, and set them beside Millie. Now, first you need to warm your hands, Max instructed as he began to rub his together. Annie was standing on the other side of the stall door watching him, as far away from the cow as she could get. Then you take the udder in your hand, and startin' from the top, you squeeze and pull down firm but gentle. You don't want to hurt her, you just want to get the milk out, he continued his lesson, showing each step as he spoke. He repeated the action several times before turning to Annie. Your turn. Annie's eyes grew large, but she seemed determined as she pulled open the gate and stepped into the stall with him. That's it, Max said with a smile, as he positioned her on the stool beside Millie. Just sit yourself right there. He stepped back to give Annie room, but try as she might, she had very little success. No, not like that, he corrected, as Millie mooed her displeasure. You forgot to warm your hands. Oh, right, Annie replied as she rubbed her palms together. That should be enough, Max instructed. Now remember what I said. Hold the udder firm, but gentle, and pull down into the bucket. Make sure to aim straight or y'all end up with milk all over the place. Slowly and very clumsily, Annie began to tug on the animal's teats, but as Max had warned, she didn't have much of an aim and squirted herself right in the face, causing her to sputter. Max pulled his handkerchief from his back pocket to wipe her face. Come, air, he said with a laugh as he dabbed her. I told you to watch your aim, that first tug is always a doozy. Annie looked up at him, the front of her dress stained with milk. I heard once that the Egyptians liked to bathe in milk, he began, watching Annie's expression as he spoke, wiping the milk from her eyes. But I didn't know they did it in New York, too, he mused as he playfully flicked the tip of her nose. Annie laughed. It was such a sweet sound, one he was little accustomed to, but already he knew he wanted to hear it again. You know what they say, everything happens in New York, Annie replied with a slight blush. Max leaned down so that they were almost nose to nose. Is that so? I bet I have something for you to do that you never did in New York. Annie took in a sharp breath, and Max tried his best not to laugh as he took her by the hand and led her from the barn. Their exercise in milking was over. He'd get more to drink if he did it himself, but he was sure there was something Annie could do. You want me to put my hand where? She questioned, as she looked at the roost of clucking mother hens, all seated on their nests. You just stick your hand under their rears and pull the eggs out. It ain't hard. Max shoved one hen aside and shoved his hand into a nest and retrieved a few eggs, placing them in a basket near his feet. You try. Annie never got to the eggs. Suddenly, there was a flurry of feathers, several loud clucks, a scream and the sound of a door slamming closed. And then he was alone. Watching the door, Max began to wonder. Could he have made a mistake in Annie Thompson? Was Bertie right, Had he chosen a woman for her beliefs and not her ability? What would happen if she couldn't get it together? He couldn't send her home. He was responsible for her. As he left, the thought followed him like a cloud. Lord, I need your help here. Chapter 6. New towns didn't mean new traditions, at least not for Annie. Every Sunday morning since she was a child, she found herself seated in the same pew, listening to Reverend Tucker expound on the Gospels. It was one of her favorite places, and while Lawton City was no New York, and their small 20-pew parish church was no Mount Pleasant church, she still found herself crossing the threshold to welcome in the week in the presence of the Lord. The small wooden church was painted completely white, with a single steeple and a large wooden cross mounted on the side. A smaller one adorned the steeple. The church was quaint, compared to the large stone structure she was accustomed to, but Annie was sure what she would receive there would be no less good to her soul as if it were coming from Reverend Tucker. Unfortunately for Annie, this wasn't her home where she was well known, and by the way the parishioners looked at her as she walked into the church, she might as well have been Mary Magdalene. She could hear the whispers following every step she took as she proceeded up the aisle. That's her. Another one of them mail-order brides. Traveling across the country for a man. Shameful. Taking a seat and doing her best to ignore the murmurings, Annie settled herself to hear the sermon. Excuse me, a loud, disgruntled voice pierced the church's solemnity. The voice was attached to a middle-aged woman in a black dress and a matching bonnet, with a face so fierce it would frighten the most hardened of men. Yes? Annie asked innocently, looking up at the stern-faced woman. You're in my seat, she accused, hands finding her hips as she cocked an annoyed head in Annie's direction. Oh. I'm sorry, Annie apologized and quickly plucked up her skirts and Bible and slid down the pew. Not there, neither. Molly sits there, and you can't be sittin' in her seat, the woman continued to protest, much louder than when she'd begun. Leave her be, Agnes, a younger woman interjected, much to Annie's relief. People have seats. She can't just come in air and think she can take a person's seat, Agnes continued to argue, but her words fell on deaf ears. You can sit by me, the younger woman offered, giving Annie a welcoming smile. She didn't wait for a second appeal, she quickly gathered her belongings and followed the young woman to a seat near the west window. Thank you, Annie stated, once they were side by side. Don't mention it. People round here can be real particular about where they sit, but you'll be safe by me. Her smile was sweet and somehow familiar to Annie, as she quickly took in the other woman's dark blonde hair and large gray eyes. I'm Annie Thompson. Pleasure to meet you. I'm Tilly. Pleasure's all mine. I've heard so much about you, the other woman responded with a small laugh. It took Annie by surprise. About me? Yes, Tilly confirmed, still beaming. Annie was confused, but the Reverend was getting into place and she knew she would have to drop the matter for the time being. Suddenly, Tilly leaned over, just as the Reverend was about to speak. I'm goin' to be your sister-in-law. I'm Max's sister, she whispered, before responding to the Reverend's somber greeting and allowing the matter to drop. Annie did her best to keep her jaw in place. The service was a beautiful one, full of the explanation of Jacob's wrestling with the angel of the Lord, and its lesson on perseverance. How are you, Lee Keen, Lawton? Tilly asked as she walked down the aisle with Annie at her side. It's very different, Annie admitted as politely as she could. I can't begin to imagine. Tilly chuckled. They stepped out into the midday sun. It was very nice to meet you, Tilly, Annie replied as she turned in the direction of the boarding house. You can't go yet. We always have a nice luncheon after church. Feed the soul and then the body, Tilly mused as she took Annie by the arm and led her to where a handful of tables and benches had been set up. People were already unpacking meals from baskets, and the smell was so delicious that it made Annie's mouth water. Surely a meal with her future sister-in-law would be better than eating alone in the cafe. All right. I'll join you, Annie conceded. But I feel terrible that I don't have something to contribute, she added, as they approached the furthest table. Don't be silly. I'm happy for the company. Mama wasn't feelin' well this mornin', so she stayed at home. I was going to have to eat all this food by myself, Tilly explained. Max wasn't in church this morning, Annie commented as she began to help Tilly unpack their lunch. He never is. My brother don't believe he needs a building to meet with the Lord. He doesn't go to church? Annie exclaimed, and once again drew the attention of the other churchgoers, who gave her a series of judgmental looks. No. Max says he feels the presence of the Lord more out in the open than he does in a stuffy old church, with people who care more about where they sit and how they look than they do about the Bible. She laughed. But you shouldn't forsake the gathering together of the brethren. Doesn't he understand that he needs to be in church? Tilly laughed again. Can a church hold the Lord? The question took Annie by surprise. Well, no. Exactly. I come to church because I enjoy it. I live in town, and it's easy to be here, but Max is hours out, and as you would have seen, he don't exactly fit the church-going folks, she mused. Annie's brow furrowed. What kind of Christian man didn't go to church? She was beginning to wonder if the letters she'd read were nothing more than a gimmick to get a vulnerable woman, like herself, out into the middle of nowhere. You all right? Tilly asked, noticing Annie's distressed expression. Annie couldn't answer. Her knees were weak at the alarming thought that she may have given up her entire life for an empty promise. You don't look so good. You best sit down, Tilly urged, as she assisted Annie onto the bench. Annie was trembling. I think I've made a terrible mistake coming here, she whispered, as Tilly held her hands in her own. Why do you think that? I don't know him. Your brother. He doesn't go to church. He isn't what I imagined. And I don't fit here, Annie replied, her voice high and on the verge of panic. Hush. Settle yourself, Tilly instructed sympathetically. Annie shook her head. You don't understand. I gave up my life. What if I was wrong? I don't know you, and I don't know the life you left. I do know that nobody's goin' to leave home to come out, if they was already happy. And I do know my brother. Max may not be the most polished of men. And he don't walk to anyone's drum but the Lord's. And it was my understanding that you feel the same, that's why you're there. She patted Annie's hand comfortingly. Keep trusting in that, she went on. If God brought you here, then he's got something for you. Just be patient. You can't know what could be, if you don't give it a chance. Annie batted back anxious tears as Tilly continued to comfort her. Why don't we eat this good food and fill our bellies, and worry about tomorrow when it comes, Tilly urged, once again getting to her feet and continuing to unpack their lunch. Annie watched her silently before composing herself enough to help. I'm sorry about that, she apologized, referring to her moment of emotion, as she pulled a pie from the basket. Don't be silly, Tilly deflected. Us women needs to stick together out there, she said with a smile, as a sense of calm filled Annie's chest at the camaraderie. Welcome to Lawton, Tilly announced, and for the first time since her arrival, Annie indeed felt welcomed. Chapter 7. When was he going to set a date? It had been 4 days since her arrival, and since that day, Max had yet to bring up the subject of their marriage again. Annie wasn't sure whether to be comforted or upset by the fact. Was he having second thoughts? Or had he never intended to marry her in the first place? Despite Tilly's assurances of her brother's character, Annie's mind was still warring with fear, and when he picked her up that morning to take her to the farm, her demeanor had been less than enthusiastic. She barely made eye contact, and her words were few and sedate. She needed to know where she stood, and soon. Annie watched Max surreptitiously as they approached the farm. He was handsome. There was no denying it. And since their last meeting, Max had undergone a transformation. His bushy hair had been trimmed around his ears and the front, though still covering some of his forehead. It was now short enough for a person to clearly see his eyes without his hat on. Even his beard had been shaved, and unlike their first meeting, his clothes fit him perfectly. She wondered why he hadn't worn those clothes when he'd met her. Annie studied his face while trying her best not to be detected. She'd never looked at a man for more than a few moments. It was impolite to stare after all, but given their proximity and his concentration on the road ahead, she felt it was safe to dare a few lingering looks. Max had a strong angular jaw with a cleft in his chin, a strong, slightly downturned nose and deep-set eyes, which were gray like his sister's. His arms were tanned from hours and hours in the sun no doubt, and muscled from years of manual labor. Some might have described his physique as somewhat of a modern-day Adonis compared to the men Annie was accustomed to, men who spent their lives avoiding manual labor, and who spent their lives sitting behind a desk counting money or treating patients. She'd never seen so many muscles in her life, and despite herself and her beliefs that the physical mattered little compared to the spiritual, his muscles did have more than a little appeal to her eyes. The sound of her name being called from the field quickly turned her attention away, before the flush in her cheeks became too apparent. "Day, Miss Annie," a deep voice called as they trotted past on the wagon. "Good day, Bobby," Annie replied brightly to the man she'd met earlier, surprised by the man's exuberant greeting. She gave him a cordial wave in return, not willing to raise her voice to an undignified level. "Hi there, Miss Annie," another voice called, and yet another, and once again Annie replied with a wave and a chipper greeting. Max commanded the horse to walk on, quickening the pace. "Something wrong?" she questioned him, at the sudden change in speed. The house wasn't that far off, and it seemed odd to speed up when they were so close to their destination. "None at all," Max replied coolly, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Just tryin' to make good time." Max pulled the wagon up in front of the house and proceeded to jump down. He walked around to assist her but found himself too late for the task. "Allow me, ma'am," Bertie Smith offered, as he raised his hands and held her waist firmly to lift her down. Annie thanked him as she braced her hands against his forearms. Once she was safely on the ground, Bertie turned his attention to his employer. "Mornin', Max. I see you brought us a pretty visitor," he mused. Bertie was Max's best friend and somewhat of a comedian, as Annie had learned on her previous visit. She'd also been told he was a self-proclaimed bachelor, who'd rather have his freedom than a female depending on him. "You're mistaken, Bertie," Max replied, and Annie felt a stab of defensiveness rise in her chest. She avoided his gaze. "I didn't bring you a visitor," he continued, as he gently took Annie by the elbow and led her toward the house. "Glad to hear you agree she's pretty," Bertie called after them, and Max's steps faltered. It was only a second, but Annie noticed. Did Max think she was pretty? The idea gave her a warm feeling in her stomach. No man had ever thought her pretty, at least not that she knew of, and the idea that Max may find her attractive made her feel special. It was a strange feeling, but she found it wasn't at all unpleasant. "I wanted to show you some of what we've been plantin' for next year's crops, but one of my horses threw a shoe this morning while I was out on a ride, so I need to go deal with that. You just stay there, and I'll be right back," Max informed her as he stood by the door, ready to exit. "If you tell me where your Bible is, I can read that while I wait," Annie said. "My Bible? I don't got one." Annie was stunned. "What do you mean you don't have one?" Max shifted his weight as he held the door open wide. A warm breeze blew through, tugging at the hem of Annie's newly acquired dress. "I can't afford one," Max admitted. "Books ain't cheap. I need to consider what's important to the farm." "And a Bible isn't important?" Annie asked incredulously. "I'm not saying that. But compared to making sure the men get paid and can feed their families, spending my money on a book isn't as important. I don't need the book in my hand to know the word. I learned it as a child. What's more important? Having the verses in your hand or in your heart?" Annie faltered. Her father had always kept a Bible on hand, but she knew he had little use for it. She, on the other hand, was ever in the good book, poring over it to learn the plan God had for her. She found it difficult to think anyone could truly know God's word without having a Bible. "How do you expect it to be in your heart if you never have the book in your hand?" she countered, with eyes firmly set on his face. Max smiled, a crooked but dashing smile. "Maybe in your big city, they need to have the Bible in hand to learn God's ways, but, the Word of God is life. You need Him to make it every day. My mama taught me and my sister verses from before we could talk." There's many a chapter and verse I know by heart. I may not have the Bible, but I assure you, I have the Mayonnaise. Annie watched in wonder as Max turned on his booted heel and left. Could he really know so many verses? It seemed nearly impossible, but didn't God work in the impossible? She stood for a moment, considering what Max had said. Was it more important to have the book in her hand, or God in her heart? Annie had always believed you couldn't have one without the other, but Max lived in a world very different to the one she knew. Here in Lawton, Tilly had told her that God's word was the first you learned, not Chaucer or Shakespeare. So why wouldn't Max know the Bible as well as she knew the lessons she'd learned in school? Several minutes rolled by and still found herself contemplating Max's comments and the change in his appearance. Could it be that she had prejudiced herself to what she thought a good Christian should be and what a good Christian should look like? Had she been doing the very thing she warned others of doing, judging someone by outward appearances? He may not have realized it, but Max Wilson was challenging everything Annie knew, in a way she'd never expected, and she was beginning to realize that what she thought a Christian ought to be, might not necessarily be accurate, and her view of God may be slightly skewed. She wouldn't get the chance to figure it out right then, though, because a heart-stopping yell shattered the morning. The front door swung open and Bertie and 3 other men came scrambling inside, a limp and bleeding Max cradled between their arms. Annie blanched at the sight. Max was the reason she'd come to Lawton, and at the sight of his lifeless body, everything she hoped for suddenly disappeared. She scrambled to his side, a prayer on her lips. "Oh Lord, have mercy." Chapter 8. Max couldn't breathe. Something was holding him tight, like a vice around a log, suffocating him, and try as he might, he couldn't get his eyes open to see what had him in its grasp. Voices were faint around him, and he couldn't make them out. Why was no one helping him? Couldn't they see he was trapped? He tried to sit up, but white-hot pain shot through his chest and stole his breath instantly. "Max?" A female's voice beckoned, breaking through the cloud of pain. Max couldn't recognize it, but he'd heard it before. It had to be a dream, one he'd been going in and out of for some time. Each time he heard her voice, he wanted to stay near it, but then it would slip through the fingers of his mind, and he would fall back into the darkness. This time, he wanted to hold on to it. "Max, can you hear me?" she spoke again. Her dulcet tones were comforting, and he did his best to focus on it over the pain trying to rip his chest in two. Luckily, the voice didn't fade away. "Max?" "It's Annie," she stated clearly. "Annie?" he groaned, still trying to get his eyes open. "Oh, thank God. I was so worried," she admitted, and Max felt a small hand take hold of his. He wanted to ask her what had happened. Why was she so worried? But it was difficult to speak. His mouth was dry, and gathering the breath to utter the words proved difficult, but finally he managed to a response. What happened? He asked with a small cough, as he tried to force his eyes open, but the light seemed far too bright, and his lids felt heavy. "I'll close the curtains," Annie announced, and Max felt the absence of her hand as she closed the curtains and erased what light he could see through the sheath of his lids. The darkness, however, did make it easier for him to open his eyes. The room was in shadows now, with only a crack of light splitting through the gap between the curtains, though that was soon remedied when Annie found and lit a candle in the corner. It took him several blinks, but soon Max was able to recognize where he was. He reached a hand to his chest to remove whatever it was that had him constricted, and found a band of cloth was wrapped tightly around his middle. "Leave that," Annie urged, gently tugging on his long fingers. "Why?" he rasped. "What happened?" "Don't try to talk," she insisted. "The less you exert yourself the better." "Why?" What had happened to him? Annie abandoned his side before Max had a chance to muster the strength to ask the questions he was thinking. The diminutive woman rushed to the table in the corner, where a pitcher of water and a glass were set. She filled the glass for him before quickly returning to his side, but it was difficult to drink. Max found it hard to sit up enough to get the water in his mouth, but Annie was there to help. She cradled his head on her arm and raised it just enough for him to get the water into his mouth with as minimal pain as possible. Once his dry throat had been dampened, Max once again tried to find out what had happened to him. What happened? You had an accident 3 days ago. You went to shoe your horse, but there was a noise in the stall, and she balked. In the process of trying to get away, she kicked you in the chest with both hind legs. She broke at least 4 of your ribs and knocked you out. You've been in and out of it since then, she divulged. She lowered his head back to the pillow. The doctor said it was lucky that she didn't have both of her shoes, or else she might have killed you, Annie confessed, worry evident in the words she spoke. No, not my time yet, Max muttered, as he tried to get his breath. The doctor said it will be difficult for you to catch your breath for a few days. He had to band your chest very tightly to keep your ribs in place. There was some concern about one puncturing your lung. I've been here every day to take of you, and Bertie has been here at night to make sure everything is all right. Max nodded. It seems you have some nursing skills, he said, as he ran a hand over his bruised ribs. I learned from my father, she admitted. Don't try to sit up. You need to stay in bed at least a few more days before it's safe for you to move about. I have to get up, Max argued, with what breath he could force into his lungs. I got fields to plant and animals to tend. Folks are relying on me. I can't let them down. I'll see to it, Annie announced. You can't. I can. You're in no condition to work right now, she insisted. Let me handle it. You can't even milk a cow, he replied breathlessly. No better time to learn than the present, she countered. I can take care of things. Really, I can. I just need this chance to show you. You'll see. Annie met his eyes, and Max was surprised by the concern and resolve that he found in the pretty face that peered down at him. All right, he responded. I'm too tired to argue. You take care of things. Let Bertie help you. I'm trusting you, he muttered, before fatigue took hold of him once more, and he drifted to sleep. Chapter 9. Beautiful. That was the only word that came to mind as Max brushed a dark curl from Annie's sleeping face. She'd been managing the farm for almost a week, a job he'd never intended for her to undertake, but one she'd taken on with more courage and determination than he would have imagined. He traced the line of her jaw, and then down to the palms of her hands, where cloths bandaged the blisters she'd received from her attempts at the plow. That had only intensified Max's determination to get out of his bed and back to work. His fiancée wasn't to be guiding a plow. That was his job. That's when it had hit him, like a slap to the head. Annie was just what he needed. She was the perfect woman to be at his side. He laughed to himself. God had shown him the answer to his prayer and the strength of the woman beside him, when he was too weak to move. Now, his eyes were clear. He couldn't let Annie go. Whatever concerns he'd had, were gone. Now, he needed to make her his. He just needed the right time to talk it over with her. A soft groan interrupted his thoughts, as Annie shifted in place, her long lashes fluttering against her cheek as she began to wake. The poor thing had fallen asleep a couple hours before while she was sharing what she'd gotten done that day. She didn't move at first, and Max silently willed her not to. He was enjoying watching her as she slumbered beside the bed, and he wasn't ready to stop watching her. He'd been on his own since he was young. His father was still alive when he'd ventured out at the age of 19. It had been 13 years of building his farm on his own, but now he no longer saw his life as solitary. Even when his sister and mom moved to Lawton City, he did the work alone. Now, there was Annie. Everything he'd asked for, God had fulfilled in one woman. I'm sorry. I fell asleep, Annie replied, as she straightened up, rubbing her knuckles against her cheek to rouse herself fully. Max didn't think as his hand reached out to give assistance, using his thumb to smooth the lines on her face. Annie stilled, and her gaze met his in silence. Her eyes were like a lush garden, rich green and full of life. He wanted to fall into that green, like he did when he was a child, and he and Tilly would hide in the rushes. May I? He asked, his eyes never leaving hers. It seemed Annie's tongue was tied. She didn't respond but only nodded her head slightly as his hand slid up the side of her face and around her neck, to where her hair was confined in a tight bun. It took him a few seconds to tug her dark curls free from their prison, and the curtain of black fell around Annie's shoulders like a perfect frame. Beautiful. Annie's cheeks turned an appealing pink at his compliment. Max decided there was no better time than the present. "I have something for ya," he said gently, forcing his hand to release the thick curl he'd wound around his finger. "Something for me?" she questioned in surprise. "It's in that drawer over there in a small box." Annie didn't hesitate, and Max watched as she crossed the room and retrieved the small wooden box from the place where he'd hidden it. Once in his hands, Max pulled the lid back and looked at the thin band of gold that rested inside. "This ring belonged to my mother," Max announced, to Annie's surprise. "When I told her I was planning on Maureen, she gave it to me. She said she wanted it to belong to the woman I chose to be my wife." He continued, his clear gray eyes focused squarely on her. "I'd be real honored if you'd wear it, Annie." "Max," she breathed, as trembling fingers rose over her mouth. He laughed. "I can't kneel down and do this proper, but I can put the ring on your finger," he proclaimed. He pulled her shaking left hand down from her face and slipped the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit, as if it had been designed just for her. "You're just the woman I need, Annie. A woman that makes a man want to be a man. Makes him want to spend his life making sure she has everything she needs, to be everything God made her to be." He took her hand and kissed it. "I'm awful blessed. Marry me?" "Yes," Annie exclaimed tearfully, and Max felt a sense of relief followed by a swell of joy. She'd said yes. He hadn't needed to fear. She was going to be his. He began to laugh and his chest hurt, but that little pain was nothing compared to the elation he felt. He held Annie's fingers, enjoying the feel of her smaller bandaged hand in his and how soft the pads of her fingers were compared to his calloused ones. Looking down at the ring on her finger, Max felt the need to speak. "I promise to take care of you. You won't regret making the choice to come here," he stated. He was determined to keep his word. He was going to be a good husband. He was going to make her happy. He'd make her forget the unhappy home she'd left, and give her a happy home with him. She squeezed his hand, and he saw her wince. "And I'm going to take you off plowing. You hear me?" She smiled. "I hear you." She gazed at him with affection. "And you won't regret it. Marrying me, I mean. I'll work to be the best wife I can be." "And Max?" His eyebrows rose. "You're everything I asked for. I've prayed so long for a man like you, and at first I will admit, I couldn't see who you were. I was so blinded by what I thought you should be, and what I thought I could do, that I wasn't sure this could work." Her confession came as no surprise. He'd had his own misgivings. "But I've come to see that you, Max Wilson, are more of a man than any man I've ever met. You don't just speak, but you live in God's love and you apply it to every area of your life. You're diligent and honest, compassionate and responsible." She laughed. "And patient," she mused. "I don't know how you put up with my silliness, but you did, and you never made me feel small for my shortcomings. So I know I can trust myself with you. I know I can marry you, without fear." No one had ever spoken to him in such a manner, and the reaction it elicited was unexpected. Max felt a spring of joyous emotion well up inside him, as he realized she saw him as the kind of man he'd prayed to be. "Let's not wait. Let's get married as soon as possible." "When?" she asked. "This Friday. That's 5 days from now. Are you sure you'll be up to it?" "Your ribs haven't fully mended," Annie questioned. Her concern made him smile. "Up to Maureen, you?" "I'm more than up for that." Chapter 10. The sun was slipping its way to the horizon, as Annie stood on the hill near the farm. Her life had changed in so many ways in the last days, and as she stood watching the wind play in the nearby field, she couldn't help but think how glorious God was for taking her through the journey. She was glad she'd waited for him to reveal the truth, about herself and about Max. She laughed as she leaned against the trunk of the old oak tree, which marked the center of Max's land, soon to be their land. "There you are," Tilly's voice broke into her thoughts. "Here I am," Annie replied as she turned to face the other woman. "Everyone's waitin' on you," she mused, a handful of posies in her hand. "I got ya a bouquet," she added, holding up the cluster of flowers. "Thank you, Tilly," Annie replied, taking the beautiful bunch in her hands and inhaling the flower's scent. "Your ma? Is she here? How's she feeling? I haven't yet seen her today." "She wouldn't miss it. Course, she's here. And happy as a lark." "Well, come on. Let's get you hitched today." The preacher was standing just outside the barn, which had been decorated in garlands of flowers. As was to be expected, Max didn't want to get married in a church, with all the citizens of Lawson at the door. He wanted something small and intimate, with the most important people present. Annie agreed. Though her parents weren't going to be there for her wedding, Annie had received a lovely letter from her mother congratulating her. She even got one from Nell, who seemed more excited than ever that she was getting married. Nell had made one request. She wanted a photograph of the wedding day, and of every child they would have. As Annie walked toward the barn, everyone turned to look at her. Dressed in a gown of ivory trimmed with chiffon and lace, and a short-veiled bonnet, she felt truly beautiful for the first time in her life. Tilly proceeded ahead of her, while Max's mother sat in a chair at the front of the gathering. She was in her 70s and thin, but she was smiling as she watched Annie approach. Annie had spent some time with her during the days preceding the wedding, and they had become quite fond of one another. She reminded Annie a lot of her own mother, and Annie was thankful to have her presence when her mother would be absent. All eyes were on her, but Annie's eyes focused on only one. Max was dressed in dark trousers and a blue buttoned shirt covered with a dark waistcoat. He was dashing. Annie couldn't help but smile as she imagined the trouble it must have been for him to get into the outfit. His ribs were still tender, but at least his breathing had improved, and his pain had significantly lessened. He'd even made an effort with his hair, slicking it back behind his head, but it was his smile that drew her in. She walked toward that and nothing else. "I was beginning to think you wasn't comin'," Max mused as Annie stepped beside him. "I wouldn't miss this moment for the world," she replied, flashing a brilliant smile as they turned to the preacher. The preacher began the ceremony, and Annie's heart skipped in her chest as Max held her hand. He squeezed it gently. The ceremony went by quickly, and before Annie knew what had happened, the preacher pronounced them man and wife, to the applause of everyone present. Annie turned to her husband. Her cheeks hurt from smiling so hard, but she couldn't stop. She was so happy. "Well, kiss her." Bertie's voice chorused, and everyone erupted in laughter, including Annie. Max moved closer, but Annie had one more surprise before they sealed their union. "Wait," she said, giving her husband a gentle smile, while everyone else looked at her curiously. "I have something for you," she announced. She beckoned to Tilly, who hurried to her side, a leather-covered book in her hand. "This is for you," she proclaimed, placing the Bible in Max's hands. "Now you can have the Bible in your heart and your hand, to teach our family as you were taught." Max flipped it open and smiled. "Thank you," he said sincerely. He pulled her to him with his free hand. "Now, can I kiss my bride?" Annie laughed. "Yes, you may." The throng around them vanished from her consciousness, as Max's lips met hers for the first time. All the world dimmed as her husband claimed her lips for his own, and her heart filled with a desire and a care she'd never known before, pure love. God's plans were indeed mysterious, and she for one, was glad for it. "I love you, Max Wilson," she breathed, as their lips parted. "I love you, Annie Wilson," he replied, and then he kissed her squarely again. Everything she'd wanted, she'd found. Her trust and his trust in God had blessed them both, and now they were starting on a new journey, one they were both eager to begin. There was no turning back. There was no desire to. The life she wanted was right there in the arms of the man she'd come to love, by the most unexpected means possible. She smiled and sighed contentedly, silently thanking God there was such a thing as mail-order brides. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.